Okay, so we're going to continue talking about factoring trinomials where the leading coefficient is 1. So this number right here is 1. So in particular, though, for this particular factoring, we're going to look at examples where we're going to have two variables involved. But before we begin, let's just review this situation from the previous example. All right, so suppose I want to factor. Let's suppose I had x squared minus 3x minus 18. So x squared minus 3x minus 18. Okay, so notice this trinomial, the leading coefficient of 1. Whenever the leading coefficient is 1, this is an easy factoring problem. In the next section, we're going to have situations where this leading coefficient is no longer 1. Okay, but I do need for you to remember the FOIL method. So remember FOIL, F-O-I-L. So we're going to kind of use the idea of reverse FOIL when doing this problem. Okay, so first thing you got to do, though, is always look for the GCF of all three terms. So the GCF of all three terms is 1. So GCF is 1. So there's really nothing to factor out. Now we're going to do examples in the next video where the GCF is something other than 1. Okay, but in this case it's 1. So now what you're going to do is you're going to write this as two binomials. So you want to rewrite this trinomial as a product of two binomials, and that's where the FOIL method is going to come in and help you. Okay, so let's think of the f in the FOIL. So remember, first terms means the first term of each binomial. So this times this has to give you this first term here, and the possibility would be x times x. So x times x is x squared. Okay. Now, once you do the first, you go to the last. So remember the last terms of each binomial. So this times this has to be a negative 18. All right. So here's how you're going to deal with this. So you want to find, remember you want negative 18. So you want to find two numbers whose product is negative 18. All right. So let's talk about the factors, two factors whose product is negative 18. For example, 18 times a negative 1 is a negative 18. Negative 9 times a positive 2 is a negative 18. Negative 3 times a positive 6 is a negative 18. So you just list the factors. Now at some point you'll be able to just look at this more efficiently and just come up with the answer. But for right now, it's a good idea to actually draw this table. Okay, and so you just continue on, but let's just look what we have so far. So I have two numbers whose product is negative 18. So that's the first thing you want to do. You want to write out these two factors whose product, in other words, when you multiply these two numbers, you get negative 18. Okay, now you want the sum. That's always the sum. You want the sum of these two numbers to be that middle coefficient. So negative 3. So the coefficient, that's that middle term. So negative 3. So you want the sum to equal negative 3. Okay? So let's see. 18 and negative 1. The sum is, remember the sum is 17. So that didn't help us. Negative 9 and 2. Negative 9 plus 2. The sum is negative 7. That didn't help us because I want the sum to be negative 3. Negative 3 plus 6. The sum is positive 3. That didn't help you. But notice this is a positive 3 and I want a negative 3. So if your sum only differs by negative sign, then what you do next is just take these two numbers and reverse the sign. So in other words, let's look at a positive 3 and a negative 6. And now when you add these two numbers up, you get a negative 3. So let's verify. 3 times a negative 6 is negative 18. And then 3 plus a negative 6 is a negative 3. So that's the one I'm going to want. Okay? All right. So what that means is this. Now, whenever the coefficient is 1, it does not matter. It does not matter where you put the 3, where you put the negative 6. So I'm going to put remember that's a positive 3, so I'm going to put the positive 3 here, and I'm going to put the negative 6 here. Okay? Now let's check ourselves. Always check. Let's do the FOIL. x times x is x squared. When I look at the outer, remember we're checking. I'm going to go ahead and check right here. Checking. I'm going to go ahead and check right here. So we're checking x plus 3 times x minus 6. This is the FOIL. X times x is x squared. The outer is a negative 6x. The inner is a positive 3x. And the last is a negative 18. And when I combine like terms, they on the inner, when I combine like terms, I get x squared minus 3x minus 18, which is what I wanted. Okay, right here. Okay, so this is the correct factorization, the correct factoring for this polynomial. Okay? All right, now let's look at this example. Suppose I want to factor, let's say I want to factor this, x squared plus 8xy plus 15y squared. Okay, so now I have a trinomial where the leading coefficient is 1, so that's a 1 right here, but now I have two variables. You can do it just like you did this, the same idea, except this time you have two variables. Okay, so listen carefully to this. Again, first of all, you're going to look for the GCF. The GCF here is still, the GCF is still 1. GCF is still 1. And then you're going to use the idea of FOIL to help you. Okay, so since the GCF is 1, I'm going to rewrite this as a product of two binomials. And remember the FOIL. So I want the first two terms right here, the first two terms to have a product that's going to be this x squared. So it'll be x times x. All right, now let's go to the last. So the last is a positive 15y squared. All right, but let's just look at the coefficients for right now. I'm going to use the same idea as we did here. Okay, so listen carefully. I want the product, to be 15. Let's just look at the coefficient for right now. So I want two numbers whose product is 15. For example, 15 times 1, 5 times 3, negative 15 times negative 1. Negative 15 times negative 1 is a positive 15. Negative 5 times a negative 3 is a positive 15. And that's about all of the possibilities for the product being 15. But remember, I want the sum. So remember, product and sum. I want the sum to be the middle coefficient. So I want the sum to be a positive 8. A positive 8. All right, so that's what we get. So 15 plus 1 is 16. That didn't work. 5 plus 3 is 8. So that's the one I'm going to want. Now, remember, this doesn't help right here because that sum is a negative 8. Okay, so that sum's a negative 8. So I want the sum to be positive 8, so I have to use a positive 3 and a positive 5. And it kind of makes sense as we go through this. So watch when we do the FOIL method. Okay, so all you do right now is this. So put, again, just like before, it doesn't matter where you put the 5, it doesn't matter where you put the 3. So let's put the plus 5 here, and let's put the plus 3 here. Now, one little bit of issue here. You see you had two variables, right? So if you multiply this out, you're only going to have the variable x. Okay, so but remember, the last has to give me 15y squared. 5 times 3 gives me 15, but I need 15y squared. So I got to put a y here and a y here, and that should now work. So let's check. Now again, you don't have to check, but let's check this. So I'm going to rewrite these two binomials, x plus 5y times x plus 3y, and I'm going to get x times x is x squared. The outer is a positive 3xy. The inner is a positive 5xy. And the last is a positive 15y squared. And when I combine like terms, so the on the inner are like terms here, I'm going to get x squared plus 8xy plus 15y squared, which is what I wanted here. Okay? So this is the answer right here. So at some point, though, you'll be able to very quickly, more efficiently, come up with the answer without having to go through all of this right here. Okay? You'll be able to do some of this in your head. Okay, now let's look at this example. Suppose suppose we had this example. Suppose we had this. So I want to factor, let's see, suppose I want to factor x squared plus 10xy, I'm sorry, let me rewrite this. X squared plus xy minus 2y squared. So x squared plus xy minus 2y squared. So just like we did in the previous problem, you look for the GCF. The GCF is 1. So there's nothing to factor out from all three terms. So I'm going to go directly now and rewrite it as two binomials. I want to write this as a product of two binomials. So let's think of the FOIL. Do the F first. So first times first has to give me x squared. So x times x gives me x squared. Now go to the last. Go to the last. All right, now think of the coefficient. Just look at the coefficient for right now. The coefficient is a -2. So I want the product to be a -2. So I want two numbers whose product is -2 and whose sum is the coefficient of the middle term. So I want the sum to be a 1. I want the sum to be a 1. Okay? So there's really just two possibilities for a product to be -2. For example, -2 times 1 is a -2, but the sum, -2 plus 1, is a -1. So that's not what I wanted, because I wanted a positive 1. Or remember we talked about if the signs, if the numbers only differ by the sign, then just do this. All right, well, let's just say a positive 2 times a -1. That's still a product of -2. But now you notice the sum is a positive 1, and that's what I wanted. So that's the two numbers I'm going to use. Okay? So now, again, whenever the coefficient is 1, it really doesn't matter where you put these two numbers. It does not matter since the coefficient is 1. So I'm going to say plus 2. I'm going to say, remember, this is -1, so I'm going to say minus 1. Okay? But don't forget that if you were to check yourself and multiply this out, you would only have the variable x. I'm supposed to have two variables, x and y. So watch this. See how the last, you want the product to be a -2y squared? Well, if I multiply 2 and a -1, I get a -2 only. So I need to put a y here. Okay? And if you look at it, a positive 2y times a -1y gives me a -2y squared. But before we check, though, because remember, I have to make sure I get that middle term. I got to make sure I get the middle term. I haven't done that yet. Before we do that, though, just remember, see how I have this as -1y? Mathematically, we prefer to write this as just x minus y. That's how we prefer to write this. So remember, if the coefficient is 1, just leave the coefficient off if it's a coefficient of the variable. Okay? Now, if it's a constant, if this were a constant, then you need it there. But since this is a coefficient of variable, you can leave it off. Okay, so let's check and see if I get that positive xy. Remember, that's where we're going to look at the out and the inner. The outer and the inner. Well, if you look at the outer, okay, the outer is a x times a negative, right here. Right here. So if you look at the outer, the x times a -y is a negative xy. The inner, 2y times x is a positive 2xy. And when I add them up, a positive 2 and a -1, when I combine these two terms, I'm going to get a positive xy. Okay? So this right here, that is your answer. Okay, so let's do one more example where we have two variables. So let's look at, let's see. All right, let's look at this example. Okay, suppose I had x squared minus xy minus 6y squared. So x squared minus xy right here. X squared minus xy minus 6y squared. All right, so remember the coefficient is 1. So whenever the coefficient is 1, that's the easiest kind. But I also want the last term to be a negative 6y squared, and I want the middle term to be a negative xy. But the coefficient is a positive 1. Okay, so the GCF, I always look for GCF first. The GCF here is going to be 1 still. All right, I'm going to use a FOIL method to help us come up with the answer. So we're going to rewrite this as a product of two binomials. So let's look at the f again. Always go to the f first. X times x is x squared. So x and x has to go in those spots. Okay, now always go to the last. Now just look at the coefficient right now. Remember, I want the product to be a negative 6, and I want the sum to be that middle coefficient. So the middle coefficient is a negative 1. Negative 1. So let's look at two numbers whose product is negative 6. So I get negative 6 times 1, but when I add them up, that sum's negative 5, so that doesn't help me. I can say 3 times a negative 2. When I add them up, I get a positive 1. I'm almost there. So you see that positive 1, I want a negative 1, just change these signs. So let's say negative 3 times 2. So negative 3 times 2 is still negative 6, but when I add them up, I get a negative 1, and that's what I want. So once you find the two numbers that work, you just put them in those final spots. Okay, so I'm going to say minus 3 and then plus 2. Okay, but don't forget, if you were to, that's not your answer, because if you were to check this, your variable would only be x. In the original problem, you have an x and a y. So you got to remember, negative 3 times a positive 2 is a negative 6, but that's not what I wanted. I wanted negative 6y squared. So you got to put 3y, negative 3y, and you got to put a positive 2y. Okay, and in your mind you can check. So in your mind you would say you would use a FOIL method to help you. So I'm going to write this over. All right, let's check the outer and inner. Remember, we haven't checked this right here. So the outer is 2xy. The inner is a negative 3xy. And when I combine like terms, a negative 3 and a positive 2 is a negative xy. And that's what we wanted. So this right here is your answer. Okay, so that's how you deal with trinomials where the coefficient is 1 and you have two variables. So it's very similar to the previous set of problems, the previous video. Same idea. Product sum, FOIL method, GCF is 1. All that's the same, except the only difference was that in these problems you had two variables.